There was something magical about walking into a farmhouse kitchen at dawn in the 1950s. Before the rooster crowed, before the milk cows needed tending, before the first rays of sun touched the wheat fields, the smell of fresh bread would already be filling the air. But here's what most people don't realize about those farm wives and their seemingly endless supply of homemade bread. They weren't just getting up early to bake. Many of them were baking in the middle of the night, and there was a brilliant reason behind this practice that had nothing to do with insomnia or poor planning. The answer lies in understanding what life was really like on an American farm during that era, and how farm wives developed a system so efficient that their families never went without fresh bread, even during the busiest harvest seasons. This wasn't about following a recipe from a magazine. This was about survival, efficiency, and making the most of every resource available on a working farm. Let's start with the heat. Summer on a Midwest farm could push temperatures well into the 90s and sometimes over 100 degrees. Now imagine firing up a wood stove or even an early gas oven in the middle of the afternoon when it's already sweltering outside. The kitchen would become unbearable. Farm wives learned quickly that baking during the coolest part of the day wasn't just more comfortable, it was absolutely necessary. Many women would start their baking around midnight or 1 in the morning, especially during summer months. By the time the sun came up and the real heat of the day began, the baking was done and the stove could stay cool. But temperature control was just one piece of the puzzle. The real genius was in how these women managed their time and workflow. A farm wife in the 50s wasn't just a baker. She was a cook, a gardener, a chicken keeper, a butter maker, a canner, a seamstress, and often a field hand during critical times like harvest. Her day was a carefully orchestrated dance of tasks that all had to get done. And baking bread couldn't interfere with everything else that needed doing. Here's where the midnight baking strategy really shined. Bread making isn't a quick process. From mixing the dough to the final loaf coming out of the oven, you're looking at several hours. But here's the thing about bread dough. Most of that time, the dough doesn't need you. It needs to rise, and rising takes time, but it doesn't require constant attention. Farm wives figured out that they could start their bread dough late at night, let it go through its first rise while they caught a few hours of sleep, then get up around midnight to punch it down, shape the loaves, and let it rise again. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the bread went into the oven, and by the time the family needed to be fed breakfast at dawn, there were fresh loaves cooling on the counter. This schedule meant that the most labor-intensive part of breakfast preparation, the bread, was already done before the breakfast cooking even began. The farm wife could focus on eggs, bacon, pancakes, or whatever else was on the morning menu without worrying about bread timing. And that fresh bread would last the family through the day, served at dinner alongside the main meal, and there'd still be enough for sandwiches the next day if needed. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more interesting. Many farm wives weren't just baking 1 or 2 loaves at a time. They were baking 6, 8, sometimes 10 loaves in a single session. Why? Because once you had the oven hot and you were already up and working, it made sense to maximize the effort. This bulk baking approach meant that a farm wife might only need to bake twice a week instead of every day, freeing up precious time for other essential tasks. The wood stove itself played a critical role in the timing. These weren't modern ovens with precise temperature controls. A farm wife had to know her stove intimately, understand how it heated, where the hot spots were, how different types of wood burned, and how long they'd keep the temperature steady. Starting a fire in the middle of the night meant she could nurse it along slowly, getting it to the perfect baking temperature by the time the loaves were ready to go in. It was a skill that took years to master, and experienced bakers could tell the oven temperature just by holding their hand inside for a few seconds. The flour situation in the 50s was different from today, too. Many farm families bought flour in 50-pound sacks, sometimes even 100-pound sacks. These weren't just containers. The sacks themselves were made from printed cotton fabric, often with beautiful patterns, and farm wives would wash them and repurpose them into dish towels, pillowcases, aprons, and even clothing. Nothing went to waste. Some mills started printing their flour sacks with particularly attractive designs because they knew women were reusing them, and it became a genuine selling point. Women would coordinate their flour purchases to get matching fabric patterns for quilts or coordinating kitchen linens. The yeast situation was interesting too. While commercial yeast was widely available by the 50s, many farm wives still maintained sourdough starters that had been passed down through families for generations. These starters needed regular feeding and maintenance, and the consistent baking schedule, even at odd hours, kept the starter healthy and active. Some women swore their bread tasted better because their starter had been fed consistently for 20 or 30 years. There were stories of starters that dated back to pioneer times, kept alive through the Depression, through 2 world wars, through every kind of hardship imaginable. The kneading process itself was serious physical work. Bread dough for a large family required real arm strength and stamina. Many farm wives developed notably strong forearms and shoulders from years of kneading multiple batches of bread every week. This was before stand mixers were common in rural homes, so everything was done by hand. Some women would knead while listening to late-night radio programs, using the quiet hours for both productivity and a rare moment of peace before the chaos of the farm day began. There was also a practical consideration about fresh bread and preservation. In the 50s, not every farm family had a reliable refrigerator yet. While refrigeration was becoming more common, rural electrification hadn't reached every corner of farm country, and some families were still using ice boxes or root cellars for cold storage. Fresh bread baked regularly meant you didn't have to worry as much about it going stale or moldy. You baked what you needed, used it within a few days, and baked again. The midnight schedule ensured there was always fresh bread without overproducing and wasting precious ingredients. The social aspect of bread baking shouldn't be overlooked either. Farm wives often judged each other by the quality of their bread. If you brought a dish to a church social or a community gathering, the texture and taste of your bread spoke volumes about your skills as a homemaker. Women took genuine pride in their bread, and the recipes were often closely guarded secrets, passed from mother to daughter with careful instruction. The midnight baking gave these women the time and quiet to perfect their craft without interruptions from children or urgent farm activities. Economic factors played a huge role too. Store-bought bread was available in towns by the 50s, but for farm families living miles from the nearest store, it wasn't always practical or economical. The cost of gas for the trip to town, the time away from farm work, and the expense of commercial bread all added up quickly. When you could grow wheat or trade with a neighbor who did, and you already had the skills and equipment to bake, homemade bread made solid financial sense. Some farm wives calculated that they could make 8 loaves of bread for less than the cost of buying 2 at the store. The quality difference was significant too. Homemade bread baked with farm-fresh eggs, real butter, and quality flour bore little resemblance to mass-produced commercial bread. It had substance, texture, and flavor that store-bought versions couldn't match. Men working hard in the fields needed substantial food, and homemade bread delivered the calories and nutrition they required. A thick slice of fresh bread with butter and jam wasn't just a treat, it was fuel for a long day of physical labor. Let's talk about the actual process these women followed. Most started with what's called a sponge method, mixing flour, water, yeast, and sometimes a bit of sugar or potato water, then letting it sit for several hours or overnight. This pre-fermentation developed deeper flavor and made the dough easier to work with. Around midnight, they'd add the remaining flour, salt, eggs if using them, and fat, either butter or lard. After thorough kneading, which could take 10 to 15 minutes of continuous work, the dough went into greased bowls, covered with clean dish towels and set in a warm spot to rise. Finding that warm spot in the middle of the night required creativity. Some women set their bowls near the still warm stove. Others placed them in the warming oven if their stove had one. In winter, they might wrap the bowls in blankets or quilts. The goal was to keep the dough at around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough for the yeast to work actively, but not so hot it would kill the yeast or make the dough rise too fast and develop off flavors. After the first rise, which might take an hour or two depending on room temperature and yeast activity, the farm wife would punch down the dough, releasing the carbon dioxide gas the yeast had produced. This would be around 2 or 3 in the morning for someone who started at midnight. Then came the shaping. For standard sandwich loaves, she'd portion the dough into greased bread pans. Some women made round loaves baked on sheets. Others might make a few loaves and use the remaining dough for rolls or cinnamon buns for Sunday breakfast. The shaped dough needed another rise, usually 45 minutes to an hour before going into the oven. Oven temperature was absolutely critical. Too hot, and the crust would burn before the inside was properly baked. Too cool, and the bread would be dense, heavy, and gummy. Most bread baked at around 350 to 400 degrees. Without a thermometer, which many didn't have, farm wives relied on experience, and sometimes traditional tests like throwing a handful of flour into the oven to see how quickly it browned, or testing if they could hold their hand in the oven for a count of 10. Once the loaves went in, the baking took anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes depending on loaf size. The sound and smell told an experienced baker when the bread was done. A properly baked loaf, when tipped out of the pan and tapped on the bottom, should sound hollow. The crust should be golden brown and firm. The aroma of baking bread filled the entire house, and on a still night, neighbors might catch a whiff drifting across dark farmland and know someone was up baking. There was something deeply comforting about that smell, a signal that life and work continued even in the quiet hours. Once out of the oven, the loaves had to cool before slicing, though there was almost always someone who couldn't resist and would tear into a hot loaf, steam still rising, slathering it with butter that melted instantly into the warm crumb. Farm wives knew that the first loaf was rarely going to make it to the table intact. It was an unspoken rule that whoever was up when the bread came out of the oven got first claim on that end piece with butter. The never running out part of the equation came from careful planning and observation. A farm wife kept mental track of how much bread her family consumed, adjusting for seasons and workload. During harvest, when there might be extra hands helping, and everyone was working harder and eating significantly more, she'd increase her baking. During slower winter months, she might cut back slightly. This wasn't written in a planner or tracked on paper. It was knowledge built up over years of feeding her family. An internal calculator that factored in how many people were eating, what other food was available, and how physically demanding the work was. Many women kept a bread box, often a metal container with a hinged lid and ventilation holes, where finished loaves were stored. The bread box kept the bread from drying out too quickly, while still allowing enough air circulation to prevent mold growth. Some women wrapped each loaf in clean cloth before storing. Others just stacked them carefully. The bread box was often one of the most used items in the kitchen, opened multiple times a day as sandwiches were made, toast was cut for breakfast, or someone grabbed a slice to tide them over until the next meal. Children growing up in these households often have vivid memories of their mothers baking at odd hours. They'd wake in the night needing water or having a bad dream and see the light under the kitchen door, hear the soft sounds of dough being worked, smell the bread baking. Some kids would creep down to keep their mother company or snag a piece of hot bread. These moments, quiet and domestic, formed lasting impressions about home, security, and family that stayed with them their entire lives. The tradition started to fade as the 50s moved into the 60s and 70s. Rural electrification was finally complete across most of the country. Refrigerators and freezers became universal, even in remote farm areas. Store-bought bread improved significantly in quality and decreased in relative cost as production methods became more efficient. Women started working outside the home more frequently, and the time-intensive practice of regular bread baking became harder to maintain alongside outside employment. Bread machines, when they arrived decades later, tried to recreate the convenience, but never quite captured the quality, texture, or the ritual of traditional bread baking. But in that era, the midnight baker was a common and respected figure in farm country. Not every farm wife did it exactly this way, of course. Some preferred early morning baking, getting up at 3 or 4 rather than starting at midnight. Others baked in the evening after supper was cleaned up and the children were in bed. But the principle was the same across all these variations. Find the time that works within the demanding schedule of farm life. Master the process so thoroughly that it becomes almost automatic, and keep the family supplied with one of the most basic and essential foods. The skill level required really can't be overstated. Modern recipes give precise measurements down to the teaspoon and exact temperatures. These women worked with approximations, adjusting for humidity, for the protein content of their particular flour, for how their specific stove was performing that day, for whether the weather was dry or damp. They knew how dough should feel at each stage, could tell by touch alone if it needed more flour or more liquid. They understood fermentation and gluten development, even if they didn't know the scientific terms for these processes. This was practical chemistry and biology, learned through repetition and passed through demonstration rather than written instruction. There were interesting variations based on ethnic backgrounds too. German farm families might have heavy rye breads in the rotation. Scandinavian families had their own traditional recipes featuring cardamom or other spices. Polish families made different styles than Irish families, who made different breads than Italian families. But across all these cultural variations, the practice of strategic timing and bulk baking remained remarkably constant. Everyone was dealing with the same challenges of farm life and finding similar solutions through practical experience. The economic impact on the family budget was genuinely significant. Bread was a staple, consumed at almost every meal in some form. Being able to produce it at home, using ingredients that were relatively inexpensive when bought in bulk, meant more money available for other necessities. Farm families weren't wealthy by any measure. Most operated on thin margins, especially smaller family farms. Every dollar saved on food production was a dollar that could go toward equipment repairs, medical care, school expenses for the children, or maybe saving up for something special like a newer tractor, or a rare trip to visit relatives in another state. The physical layout of farmhouse kitchens was specifically designed around this kind of serious food production work. Large work tables, often 6 or 8 feet long, provided ample space for kneading and shaping multiple batches of dough. Deep sinks could handle the biggest mixing bowls and bread pans. Substantial stoves had multiple oven compartments and plenty of stovetop space for various tasks. Pantries were sized to store those 50-pound flour sacks, 5-gallon crocks of lard, and rows upon rows of home-canned goods. These weren't show kitchens designed for appearance. They were legitimate workspaces designed for producing large quantities of food efficiently. Weather patterns played into the baking schedule too. On rainy days when field work was impossible and everyone was stuck inside the house, a farm wife might bake extra, knowing people would be underfoot and snacking more frequently throughout the day. Before a big storm was predicted, she'd make sure there was plenty of bread on hand in case the weather turned bad for several days and nobody could get to town. During the intense periods of planting and harvest, when every single daylight hour counted and couldn't be wasted, the midnight baking became even more valuable because it didn't interfere one bit with the critical outdoor work. The bread itself varied in complexity depending on the occasion. Daily bread was often a straightforward white or wheat recipe, reliable and relatively quick as these things go. But for special occasions, Sundays or holidays, farm wives would make fancier breads. Braided loaves that took skill to shape properly, sweet breads loaded with raisins and warming spices, rich egg breads with a beautiful golden color, or special ethnic recipes that took even more time and skill to execute properly. These special breads were usually made during more convenient hours, but the everyday bread, the bread that kept the family fed day in and day out, that was the bread made in the dark, quiet hours while everyone else slept. There's something almost meditative about baking bread in the middle of the night. The house is completely quiet. The farm is still except for maybe an occasional animal sound in the distance. There's time to think without interruption, to work through problems, to plan the coming day in detail. For many farm wives, those midnight hours in the kitchen weren't just about efficiency, though they certainly were efficient. They were also a rare moment of genuine solitude and peace in lives that were otherwise filled with constant demands, noise, and the needs of others. The rhythmic process of kneading, the patience required for proper rising, the attention needed for successful baking, it all required a focus that pushed other concerns and worries aside temporarily. Some women would pray while they kneaded, finding a spiritual element in the ancient act of making bread, connecting it to biblical passages about daily bread and Christ as the bread of life. Others treated it as purely practical work, their minds already on the 100 other tasks waiting for them when the sun came up. But regardless of their individual approach, they were all part of a tradition that stretched back through countless generations, women feeding their families through skill, knowledge, and hard physical labor. The transition away from this practice didn't happen all at once or uniformly. It was gradual, stretching over decades and varying by region and family circumstances. By the 1980s, homemade bread had become unusual rather than standard in most rural households. The knowledge and skills that had once been essentially universal among farm wives became specialized, something only particularly interested people maintained as a hobby or passion. Today, artisan bread baking is experiencing a revival in popularity, but it's a hobby or passion project for most people, not a daily necessity or a matter of family survival. What those midnight bakers achieved was genuinely remarkable when you really stop and think about it. They were managing complex time schedules that would challenge anyone, maintaining consistent quality with variable ingredients and equipment that required constant adjustment, doing physically demanding work that built real muscle, all while shouldering a dozen other major responsibilities. They did it without recognition, without praise, without anyone suggesting they deserved credit, because it was simply what was expected of a farm wife. The reward was a table that always had bread, children who never went hungry for lack of this staple food, a husband who had the fuel he needed for brutal physical labor, and the personal satisfaction of being genuinely skilled at something fundamentally important. The lessons from that era extend well beyond bread-making techniques. They're about resourcefulness and making do with what you have. They're about using the hours you have available, even if they're inconvenient hours that most people would never choose. They're about mastering essential skills thoroughly enough that you can adapt successfully to changing circumstances and unexpected challenges. And they're about the deep value of doing fundamental work well, taking pride in the basics that keep a family functioning. Modern life operates on completely different principles, with different challenges and different solutions. But there's still something valuable to be learned from those farm wives who could practically make bread in their sleep, who never ran out because they planned ahead carefully and worked smart, not just hard. They understood their resources, their time constraints, and their family's needs, and they developed systems that worked reliably year after year. So the next time you're in a grocery store reaching for a loaf of mass-produced bread without a second thought, take just a moment to consider what went into keeping families fed before that was even an option. Think about women getting up at midnight in a dark farmhouse, firing up a temperamental wood stove, kneading heavy dough by hand until their arms ached. Also, their families would have fresh bread at breakfast and throughout the day. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't easy by any measure. It was hot in summer, the hours were terrible, and the physical demands were real. But it worked. And it worked because those women made it work through skill, careful planning, experience, and sheer determination. They were the backbone of farm family nutrition, and their contribution deserves to be remembered and respected. The smell of fresh bread baking at midnight, drifting across quiet farmland, was the smell of dedication, skill, and a kind of love that showed itself through actions rather than words. It was the smell of home, of security, of knowing that no matter what challenges the day brought, there would be bread on the table. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed learning about how 1950s farm wives managed to keep their families supplied with fresh bread through midnight baking and smart planning, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content about historical farming practices and rural American life. Share this with anyone who loves history or appreciates the hard work that went into daily life before modern conveniences made things easier. Remember, this video is inspired by real facts and historical practices and is not meant to represent or offend anyone. These were the genuine realities of farm life in that era, and this content aims to honor the skill and dedication of the people who lived it.